Charlene O'Hanlon, Managing Editor at DevOps.com, DevOps TV, and I'm here at DevOps Enterprise Summit, Las Vegas, 2018, doing some great interviews and meeting some really fascinating people. And I have another group of really smart people next to me. I've got Damon Edwards, I've got Cornelia Davis, and I've got Tom Limoncelli. So we're going to talk a little bit about IT operations and next-gen ops in general. These guys are stellar stars in the IT operations space, so hopefully they'll be able to give me a little bit of maybe insight into what's happening into IT operations. So Cornelia, let's start with you. When we're talking about next-gen ops, we're kind of obviously looking forward a little bit. What are some of the things that kind of you're seeing that's maybe perhaps shaping the IT operations space in the next year or so?
So it's funny, when you were just introducing us and you mentioned that we're, have a lot of experience in the IT ops space. I actually don't. I
Really?
am a developer by background,
Okay.
and I have been working for Pivotal for the last 5 years and realized very early on in that journey, I work on platforms. And theoretically, those platforms were for the developer. I work on a PaaS platform. But I learned very, very quickly that it's not actually a developer platform, that it's an ops platform just as much as dev. And so I say that in answer to your query, in that I believe that we are going to continue to see that transformation in ops. I spend a lot of time out with customers, and I still find that most customers still have the traditional plan, build, run, which is really more around IT systems, and then the developers are yet another group that's off to the side. I think that what we will continue to see is we will continue to see the processes and the technologies to support the fragmentation of operations, so that it's not just some IT group that is doing ops. It's actually the dev teams that do ops. The IT groups are going to continue doing ops, but they're going to do ops for a different layer. I think fundamentally that's the way that I would sum it up, is that we'll start to see layers of operations where it used to be operations was done kind of holistically by one group.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Yeah, and I think that highlights is there's two transformations going on. One is the sort of, I guess we call it the infrastructure, but infrastructure meaning everything. It's an architecture discussion. It's kind of the cloud native, right, as the moniker. It's been on to that, and that's kind of how you get things like Cornelia was talking about coming from, how the platform, right, used to be kind of some part of the platform was an ops concern, some part of the platform was a dev concern, and every once in a while we would try to glue them together, right? Usually in a production launch. How the rethinking on that for these cloud native architectures is fundamentally changing the nature of operations. And then I think there's the realization on the other side, which is all of this pressure from the go sort of DevOps, digital transformation. And then at the same time, everything's getting a lot more serious because it's becoming a bigger part of the business. That's so lock it down more. It's kind of ops is being squeezed, which means we have to change how we work. We're never going to move fast enough under these old siloed command and control, driven ways of working. So now we see much more kind of lean or agile and kind of inspired ways of working. A lot of what Tom's talk was about today was about how do you start to inject these things into an organization. So I think that is kind of the big transformation going on in operations, is the architecture is totally changing and the operating model or the way of working is totally changing. So you can take advantage of all that new architecture stuff. Otherwise, you're going to be kind of left behind.
And a lot of it is about new skill development, both on the dev side and the operations side. And it's scary. A lot of operations people say, well, I'm not a coder, and you say we're going to automate our operations. Do I have a place? And they absolutely do, because operations automation is really just taking what you know already and doing it a little bit differently. But that's a new skill that needs to be learned.
Yeah, and it's funny, you get this funny thing where developers are like, yes, we get to, we want to take control. We want to get, we want to, kind of get in there. It's a lot of the no ops sort of idea was like, yes, this urge to finally, we don't have to wait for ops. We're going to take over. And then they get in there and they're like, take it back. I don't want it. Right? I don't want it. Right? Oops,
I've heard a lot of developers say things like, I don't want to do any operations because they think DevOps means I have to carry a pager. Right.
Right.
But what's
Well, let me say there's a couple of what's new in operations or the next generation of operations. First of all, it's businesses acknowledging that operations exist. Because in a lot of companies, a lot of big companies, they think that the goal is writing the code. And what they're learning is that for decades, what they didn't realize was the code gets written once, but you run it every day. And that makes operations millions of times more important or more pressing than development.
Ops is the business, right?
Ops
That's
is
where
the
you
business.
where you make your money is right there. I mean, yes,
Right.
you have to have the right parts, the right, the special sauce comes from development. You have to, but it has to run. Otherwise, you're fundamentally not making money. Full stop. Right.
Right. It used to be if the system was down, that's okay because we run payroll once a month. But you can't say, well, the website's going to be only up from 9 to 5. It's a transition to a 24/7 environment. So as a result, there's much more emphasis on how do we scale the people we have through automation. How do we become less reactionary? So we don't want to monitor to know when things are down. We want to monitor to know when things are sick so that they can be fixed ahead of time and they never do go down.
Gotcha.
I want to circle back to something that you said, Damon, as well, around cloud native architectures.
Okay.
Because cloud native architectures, and that's especially coming from a development background, I spend a lot of time thinking about that. I'm actually writing a book around cloud native architectures, but it's a cyclical thing. The cloud native architectures are what's enabling us to refactor the way that we organize our dev and operations groups. And it's also the need for reorganizing and gaining efficiencies around development and operations that's driving the existence of cloud native architectures. And I find that very fascinating that we've got this cycle. And I think I was just chatting with a colleague of mine last week, and we were talking about some technology. We were talking about event logs. We were talking about Kafka in particular. And he had seen a presentation that Neha, who's the CTO of Confluent, had given a couple of weeks before, and he said, I watched a presentation and I was like, yeah, I was talking about this stuff at TIBCO 20 years ago. And we chatted a little bit about that, and one of the points that I made is that the context is different. And it's the context is the architecture is different, the application architectures are different. So the way that we're doing messaging across things, well, the components are different. That part of the context is different. And then again, this need to be able to deliver a digital transformation. Every company is a digital company, and they constantly need to be delivering digital offerings. That's also driving changes in the way that messaging, in this particular case, we were talking about messaging, how that happens.
It's interesting that we're talking about cloud native architectures in relation to IT operations, because you kind of think that because we are moving to a more cloud-based infrastructure, that maybe the need to have IT operations is a little bit less, or maybe their job roles are changing a little bit because of the fact that we've got both on-premises architectures and cloud-based architectures. Am I wrong in thinking that way, or is that something?
I think you're right. I think the difference is that people's jobs are moving up the stack. So it used to be people are managing the running cables, very low level parts of the stack, and now what's important in operations is more the application layer, and to do that well, you have to be integrated with the developers so that it's a collaborative environment, not a waterfall environment.
So it's more meaningful. Actually,
it's much more meaningful.
Yeah.
Your job, your role in a company is much more valuable when you're working at higher levels of the stack.
Well, it's like I think operations matters more. Like you're actually an operator, right? I think that's kind of the difference. Is a lot of those lower level concerns that are abstracted away are kind of non-differentiating. A lot of setup type things, right? It's not even infrastructure built, it's like setup. It's like plugging cable, rack and stack. We're worried about sort of managing lower level storage and things like that. Now it's like that frees you up. The emphasis is on operating, because Tom said these are 24 by forever services,
right.
And it is the business. That is literally the business. It's not some system that supports some paper trail that you did before, or the customer can always call back tomorrow, take their order on paper. But I mean, literally, this is the 24 by forever business, and so you have to learn how to operate those complex systems. And this can focus. You can focus on that. So there's no less operations happening. It's just happening higher up the stack and in a more interesting way.
Right. In fact, studies have found that people don't go to websites that are down.
Well, that makes sense. It makes total sense.
But also, not only do they not go to those websites, but they.
I'm going to Google. I don't believe you on that one.
Okay, well, so it turns
I
out
want to
not
cite your
only,
source there.
but when the website comes back up, that they don't come back to that website.
Right.
They've already gone to a competitor and they stay there.
Yeah, that's right. That's right, because they're going to order pizza for the Super Bowl, and if the pizza ordering site is down for the Super Bowl, well, the Super Bowl has gone and passed.
Right.
So,
And now they have set up an account at that other pizzeria, and they're just going to start ordering from them from now on.
yeah, you know, this whole thing about moving up the stack, one of the things that I find very interesting is that I spend part of my time in Oregon, in Central Oregon, and there are some data centers out in Central Oregon, in Prineville, just kind of east of Bend. And I was chatting with somebody once who had moved from kind of, I think either Dallas or Austin. I think Dallas, because there's a fair bit of, I think they had worked for EMC or something like that before, and they heard that I believe is Amazon and Facebook. They all have, several of those big companies have data centers in Prineville, and they said, well, we moved out here because I thought I would get my next IT job there, and they moved out to Oregon and found that, in fact, the IT jobs aren't there. The data centers are there, but they're these dark data centers.
Yeah.
They don't have anybody who's doing IT systems the way that they used to do IT systems in Texas.
Right. You need 2 employees at a data center, a person and a dog. And the person is to make sure that no one comes in, and the dog is there to, no, I'm sorry. The person is there to feed the dog, and the dog is there to make sure that the person doesn't go into the data center.
Nobody gets in.
Right.
Yep, exactly.
So in that respect, then the dog is more important than the person.
Yep.
Oh, I wouldn't say that about my friends that do work at data centers, but
But you know,
Dog feeders.
there's another really important skill that I think those skills that people have had around IT operations and doing kind of the metaphorical plugging in of cables, and it's not just plugging in of cables, it's, you know, again, coming from a development background, I could not configure a firewall. You don't want me, you want to keep, you need that dog to keep me away from the firewall, right? Nothing good comes of that. But those individuals that have known how to configure firewalls, we don't want them to day in and day out work off of a queue to configure the firewall, because there's that delay in the ticketing system. But we need that expertise to have them help to set up the automation and to set up a policy framework around being able to now, hey, if I'm deploying an app, I'm pushing an app into this particular area, there's some automation set up that takes all of that knowledge that that person had around configuring the firewall and automates that. So we do need those folks to help us stand up those platforms. The platforms do the automation, but we need that skill set to configure those platforms the right way.
Yeah.
You know, good.
And those people often resist that transition, but what they find is because they resist for many reasons. It's scary, change is scary, but also they think they're going to lose their job.
Right.
But instead, their job becomes more valuable because now they're not spending all their day click, click, click. They're working higher up the stack and deciding, what are these policies?
Yep.
So we were talking about the architecture differences and sort of ways of working difference, and this is where SRE comes in, is when the change in the ways of working. And one of the fundamental things is that's been brilliant about it is it's finally given a name to what Cornelia was talking about, is this word toil. And the idea is it's work that fundamentally doesn't add enduring value to the organization. It's repetitive. It's probably rote. It should be automated, or it's automatable. A machine could do it, or a robot could do it if it was the cables. And it scales linearly with the service. With a billion users, we're going to have that many number of people doing these services. And they're like, that doesn't add value to the organization. What does add value to the organization is engineering work. And that doesn't just mean like I'm a software developer. It could be all sorts of things. But I'm taking an engineering mindset to saying it takes work that takes human creativity and adds enduring value to the company. And this kind of switch, this new way of working, is saying that, hey, we need to track that because we want to have our people working a maximum amount of there's a maximum limit of the amount of toil we want to accept. I know the Google, benchmark is 50%, but the idea being that we always want to have extra time for engineering work, because then the engineering work could be creating automation to get rid of more toil, or actually doing things that move the business forward. And these people are discovering, as you get through this, if you free up these operators' time, they have all this knowledge of how things actually work and how you can improve the stability and the reliability and the speed of the system. So therefore, if we free up that engineering work, there's all this human capital that's being created in the organization, and they just find more to do, right? And the business moves forward. So that's one of the major shifts of this kind of new operations ways of working we're talking about is like that idea was not the old way. The old way was, oh great, these operators, if they're not doing 100% toil, 110% at all times, they're not efficient, and we should make them more efficient, and it's just it doesn't move the business forward. In fact, it makes things worse because you're in a spiral because you don't have the engineering work to get rid of that toil, so you're never going to get anywhere.
Yeah, when I used to work in like IT help desk environments, they talk about for every X employees that we hire, we had to add one system administrator, and that kind of linear growth is what people try to do in operations, but it's actually very different. It's more like 6 people should be able to run a service, and no matter how big that service gets, whether it's 20 million users or 50,000 users, and the Google benchmark is 6 employees can run a service, or SREs can run a service. The only change is if you need follow the sun coverage, then it's 5 times the number of time zones.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you remember
and that's a much better scaling model for your business.
Do you remember the old metric? It was always like systems administrators to servers. Like remember the network world that had like the centerfold with someone's network diagram and all that, like all those days. And every product was always bragging about certain systems administrators to servers, right? And that is the perfect example of because those jobs were based in toil, and it was scaling linearly. And now these kind of the SRE sort of way, it's a lot of different things, but people kind of SRE moniker goes around it. They've broken that. They've decoupled that to where it's about, running the service and about automating that toil, so we're not stuck in that toil trap.
One of the metrics that we use at Pivotal with our customers, because again we sell a platform, is the ratio that we look at is the number of platform individuals, so people who are responsible for creating and operating the platform, relative to the number of consumers of that platform, so the number of developers that are enabled. Okay. And that's a super interesting metric, is to say, oh, I can run the platform with 6 people, and that's enabling 1,500 or 2,000 developers, because those developers are of course creating the digital offerings that are driving your business.
So it sounds like, in broad strokes, IT operations looking ahead is going to be a lot more automated. We're going to rely on automation a lot more, and it's going to be add even greater value to the organization. So those are 2 things I can.
And it's layered.
Right. I'd add one fine point to that, which is it's going to be more automated to elevate the operators.
Right.
I think that's kind of the thing where it goes wrong. Once you get in the reality of it, it's like, oh no, like automation it's like a superpowers, or it's like a mechanized suit, and I don't know what video game that is, right? But it's like it's that idea, like the automation is there because then it either clears things away, clears away the noise, or force multiplies their attention or whatever it is, or their the number of hands they have. But it's fundamentally organizations that are very successful in this operations transformation. The automation elevates the human beings. It makes their humans, the human capital, to use the flowery term, right?
Automation assists people, it doesn't replace people.
That's a simpler way to say it. That's why he writes books.
All right, then. All right, Damon, Cornelia, and Tom, thank you so much for taking the time and talking with me about IT operations. It's fascinating, and I think we're going to see a lot of movement in the space next year. So thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank
you.
you.